or this is what, episode 6. We kind of had to restart a little bit here, in part because, and let's see, this will be a new video. So we're switching over to some different broadcasting software where we were using Google Hangouts, but that's at its end of life. So we're shifting over to Open Broadcaster software, an open source, essentially streaming platform. Its advantage is it lets you use just about anything you want. You just sort of pipe it through that. But that means, some of the ease of use we had with Google Hangouts. Most people have a Google account, so they could just get in through Chrome. You can share desktops and content really easily. We'll have to figure out some ways to negotiate that. But it is relevant to what we're doing because we are, in part, looking at how tools act on situations. Right?
Yeah.
So right now we're using Skype for Business. We did have a little bit of an issue with it. It doesn't seem super adept at sharing things to participants. It was telling us the thing I wanted to do, which was simply, share some content, is only available in conferences. I don't know what this is, if not a conference. So we'll get some other kinks worked out, I suppose. But this, does speak to sort of the things we're investigating in the context of this project.
Yeah.
So this will probably be a brief episode. There's no guest. It's just us to sort of go over where we are now and what to do in the future. I'm going to switch this over to this. So I mentioned last time that data collection's ongoing. Nathaniel, I guess you can't see this, although it should be piped to the live stream. We've got 2 samples, essentially, the way it's working. And both of these are shared on the project page. Let me just pull that up really quickly. You can kind of see how the project page, and that's always sort of getting revised in terms of how it's structured. We've got a section for main texts where we've got an overview of the project. Nathaniel, you posted this information about essentially kind of the theoretical approach we're taking. Excuse me. And then a list of credits, something we talked about with Kathleen Fitzpatrick. This issue of how do you, assign sort of granular credit, or I don't know, is credit a good name for this, Nathaniel?
I think that's, as we were talking, as our conversation with her, sort of struggling through that, right? Credit or attribution or, some sense that the people that are participating are getting some sort of recognition or some attribution that they've contributed something to it. So, but in part, I think that the trouble already gets revealed in the waffling in terms of what we want to call, even, are they guests, right? If we call them guests, what does that signal? Are they consultants? But consultants makes them feel as if they're potentially outside the project.
Right. Right now they're called guest contributors.
Yeah.
And that may have, are they invited contributors? But yeah, and if there are other ways to participate in the project, we'll have to kind of reconcile, how to articulate those.
And I think one of the things that Kathleen added to it as well is that I think we'd been sort of thinking about getting people interested and sustaining their interest through the project. And one of the things that she introduced was the idea that different people could become interested at different stages. Mm-hmm. So the notion is, right, we have our list of guest contributors, but right now they're just listed there. would theoretically in the future we'd have some of them would be like Casey would be, June through August of 2019, and then drop, because people will be not consistent contributors throughout, but potentially being brought in at a particular stage in the project and then dropping away as their, as their interest or their own expertise became less, but the certain temporality to the contribution as well. That some people might be there early on and not be there later. Yeah. And so even figuring out measurements, right? How much did they contribute, but also when did they
Yeah.
contribute?
And if it's meaningful, I mean, we may ultimately produce something like a timeline, right? With you can even imagine the y-axis having contributors. You see these kinds of things on, for example, Wikipedia, when it tracks things like the members of a band, right?
Right.
Do you know the visualization I'm talking about, where it shows overlapping timelines of participation, right? So the x-axis will be your whatever your time duration is. Y will be contributors, and then it shows sort of at any point in time, here's who was engaged, right?
Yeah.
If that's relevant, it's something we might consider. So yeah, we've got the credits there. I'll be adding something here about the data collection methodology. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit, but a similar text. So right now under texts, we can almost see this as sort of parts of the eventual manuscript, right?
Right.
They're written, in a kind of vernacular way, so probably they will undergo revision. But these will probably be sort of the materials that we will be aligning into a draft.
Mm-hmm.
So other sections here, and I'm trying to sort of parse this or reduce this so there aren't a lot of places to sort of get overwhelmed when you look at this page. We've basically just got texts and resources. I removed the activity stream, which I thought was useful because it showed you changes.
Yeah.
However, for one thing, Manifold I believe hides it by default, which was interesting, but when I turned it on, one of the reasons may be that it doesn't quite work. Things nested inside collections, those links will break on the activities stream. So you'll click on the links for some things, sort of top level things, and it'll go right to them. But if it's something that's in a collection, it'll give you a 404 that it's missing. It's clearly just something like a hierarchy problem. It's trying to point, it needs to point to the directory and then the thing inside it.
Right.
But, as I think we kind of maybe messaged each other about, we could report that as a bug to Manifold, although we think we're not using the most current version.
Right.
So presumably the response to that bug would be update.
Yeah.
Fix your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something we did want to address today is, because it's something we've mentioned before, updating and seeing what the possibilities are there. So then just really quickly, we've got the collection of the discussion episodes here in one discrete category. As we talked about with Kathleen, it sort of defaults to this order, which I believe is just the order of upload. The user has some ability to change what they're seeing here in terms of the directional sort. Different types, which isn't quite relevant in this collection, but is in the other one. Tags, we haven't tagged anything yet. I'm kind of on the fence. I used to be a larger proponent of tags, but I was reading something just the other day, sort of the standard hyperbolic web post, I think just called Tags Suck. And it was sort of about how folksonomies really seemed like a great idea, but in practice, they're not quite shaking out. I mean, they expand to where they become cumbersome, right? I mean, there's so many tags.
Yeah.
And it is an interesting kind of mechanical Turk problem because, in part, you're dealing with semantic issues, right?
Yeah.
That's something we were even talking about for this project. If you had people categorize, the reading materials we're using or the terms we pull out of the data we're analyzing, the category terms they use for those are going to be different, right? There's going to be some variance.
Right.
And it's not the same thing as just like a misspelling or, an ending issue. It's, a different cognitive take, a semantic take on, well, this is what is being talked about in this category. And someone else would say, no, this is what's being talked about in that category.
Right. It's almost as if tagging the folksonomy conversation has now become mature enough that there's now an issue of inter-rater reliability.
Yeah,
with respect to tag. Like there is, so the problem with tags as they exist in online spaces is there's no inter-rater reliability.
yeah. I mean, there's you can do things like number of times something. There are ways to fudge that. If similar things get classified this way by a lot of people, that can be a little unusual because of the way tags are usually set up as ant trails, right?
Right.
So if you go to use a tag, it'll, for example, autocomplete. So you can be like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. There are ways to fudge that, but there is almost always, um, there's an ontology that's missing there, right? Um, you know, like Victor Raskin at Purdue. Did you ever have him?
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was working, and may still be, on ontological semantics, right? Doing things like allowing machine readable stuff to have a sense of what this is about, and a lot of that comes down to the connections between terms or frequently used phrases or those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
So this term and this term are semantically close. They mean kind of the same thing. They're talking about the same thing, whereas this term and this term are very far apart. Now, interestingly, when we look at our data, that's one of the things we're actually going to be doing is
Yeah.
mathematically plotting things. You can do that with word vectors, principally. That's a way to compute, okay, what's being talked about here, and then how semantically close. It actually breaks it down numerically, but what you're getting is a sense of meaning, right? How close are these things? But the point is, unless that kind of structure is behind a folksonomy, you run into these issues. And it seems like the folksonomy, the sort of large-scale web tagging has started to wane. Things like YouTube have attenuated tagging videos. It's interesting. This may, in fact, kind of link with the rise and fall of what was presumed to be the semantic web.
Mm-hmm.
Tim Berners-Lee was a large champion, and other folks, of what they saw Web 3.0 was going to be the semantic web, where what we saw online was going to be both readable by people and readable by machines, right? Cory Doctorow and others kind of thought it's a great idea, but it seems like a little bit of a pipe dream, because if you're talking about all this extra stuff, it's like, where's that coming from? Unless Turk-like machines are going to be applying that, generating that stuff, you're asking people to do this, and that has such huge issues. Not only just doing stuff, but as you point out, it's not like there's human consensus, right?
Right.
So the semantic web, it seems like, is a little bit on the wane. I remember last year, in fact, kind of reading a few think pieces about what happened to it. I think if you Google for "is the semantic web," it probably pops up dead. Let's see, is the semantic? Yep. Sure enough.
Right, because it presumes that that there's already a generalizable universal semantics
Yes.
that will then show up online, and there isn't one already, so there's not going to then be another version of it.
Yeah, or I think the hope of people like Berners-Lee was that machines would do this. They would assemble the ontology, right? And it felt,
Right.
when this was being discussed, as though we were on the cusp of this. Our investigation is looking at precisely, in a way, this issue, right? What is that overlap between bot-like work and human-like work? But I haven't noticed a lot of posts on Mechanical Turk saying, contribute to the semantic web. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It almost seems like it was the having just taught again history of rhetoric 2 that basically starts in the 16th century with John Locke's notion of, right, we'll have this universal dictionary,
right,
where all these, right, it's the idea that, well, probably humans can't do it, but we could probably get bots could finally bring to fruition the dream of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, because there is this presumption of neutrality in the machine, right? which is of course utterly incorrect. Right? I mean, there's
Right.
any number of works now that are about the biases of algorithms. What was that you were drinking? Four Loko?
No, it's just a big tea. It's a tall boy tea.
um, you don't know how you can get through these without something, right?
It's Monster Energy drink, which is officially the sponsor of Mechanical Turks.
Right. Yeah, but anywho, there's a lot of pieces right now about, that the algorithms reflect biases, often sort of our own biases in terms of constructing them. Certainly you see that in Mechanical Turks, that, a lot of times they're being used to train machine learning algorithms. So,
right.
They're subjective, right? There is this
Yeah.
presumption of objectivity that, you're right, I mean, spins out of the Enlightenment and perhaps even has further roots back in Plato and
Sure.
yeah,
and even if you could have a bot that's not biased, you'd still have to feed it something.
Yeah.
So these interesting things of, right, even if so the idea too that bots are biased, or right, that these kind of things, it's like, yes, they have one in the sense that it's its own being sensing object, right? It's in the same way that a 35, like same reason that different camera lenses are biased, right, in that sense. But you're also going to feed in police data, like for this sort of predictive policing, right? Even if the algorithm isn't biased, it's being fed information from the 1970s forward that absolutely is.
Right.
So even if you've got a sorting mechanism, you're still going to have to give it information that comes from someplace else.
Yeah.
And so that's where a lot of, these, and they have really interesting and as you sort of suggested, long-term, deep historical roots, right? There's there's a great piece, and I can't think of the name now, but it's called Sim Factory, and it's a piece about these basically sort of AutoCAD stuff where they create these simulated environments in which you can build factory lines. And there's little sims that you use to determine how to space things and how tall, right, and how to do these things. And those sims are basically amalgamations of statistical data that goes all the way back to the dawn of, like, when you could start prefabricating homes, right? The statistics that the sims inside of this current 2019 simulation, the things that it's peopled with are like 100 years old.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
In terms of what a bodily norm looks like. They're using statistical measures that were created hundreds of years ago, or at least 100 years ago.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Right. Sorry, I was pulling that up. Maybe you're talking about the actual. There's a simulation program that.
Yes, basically a program that allows factory designers to anticipate the needs of workers.
Right. Yeah.
But the Jane and John Doe that are available, those come from norms,
right,
that are based on statistical tools created.
Yeah.
When we have to make these drafting, now that we can make prefabricated homes, how big should the doors be? Because we're going to make 100 of them. How high off the ground should toilets be? And those production techniques emerge about the same time that the statistical techniques for creating the notion of the norm become available.
And, of course, the metaphor of the Turk itself, right, is born in mechanization. Right?
Yeah.
And in a sense, there's part of our project that is looking at what the human is now. Right? I mean, in the industrial age, the human became mechanized, right? Things like time clocks, right? Your units of labor were quantified. It is interesting that, it uses, as we've talked about, the metaphor of the Turk that is unsurprisingly kind of pulled out of this other era. But the question sort of is, how has the notion of what a human is changed?
Yeah. I think this gets us back to the other thing I think we were going to discuss is sort of keeping fresh in our minds our previous discussion with Casey Boyle, when we were sort of discussing the notion of a cultural technique and his not admonition, but like not to make
Mm-hmm.
the mechanical Turks, the cultural technique, but to see mechanical Turks as a manifestation of a particular cultural technique, right? That we could triangulate it across like things like Fiverr and the Lime scooter. And I think that gets us back, right, that we can see a particular manifestation as part of this larger cultural technique that's going to necessarily include things that are sort of like Mechanical Turk, but not like Mechanical Turk. Um, but it's leveraging something similar there in the ways in which we could see, right, that the ways in which statistical norms are also tied to drafting manuals and contractors and architects, right? That all that, they look like different things, but they're actually all coming out of the same kind of cultural technique.
Yeah.
And so to a certain extent with Mechanical Turks, we've not identified the cultural technique. We've identified a kind of a version of it,
Right. Yes.
or a practice of it.
Yeah.
Um,
And so one thing we were kind of talking about is how much of that we'll be able to inscribe, right? Because in order to trace it thoroughly, we'd have to look at many of these manifestations, right?
right.
So we may be able to gesture to parts of those, but we won't be looking at them with the same kind of close depth that we'll be looking at this one. But it'll help us triangulate and perhaps have evidence for, when we say we're seeing this, we can see it also in X, Y, Z in these ways, right?
Yeah.
Right. And did we add that? I don't think we added that particular point about what Casey was saying to our notes page. So, I mean, right now I've got pulled up in the stream, and this is accessible here on, gosh, I never even mentioned it. So the other section here, we've got the episodes and we've got the supporting resources. Now, inside the supporting resources, we've got basically a video overview that I did at Computers and Composition. We've got a link to our Notes Google Doc, and then we've got links to the 2 data samples. But we may fold that kind of information into this notes page so we can start kind of wrangling our content together.
Yeah.
Because there are related things here, things like bot workers in click farms, or what are sometimes called gold farms.
Yeah.
Where, for apps or whatever, to demonstrate they've got a lot of users, sometimes they will make use of Turk-like services that are basically just often humans automated in interesting ways. I mean, some of these click farms, if you look at them, it's not like computer programs simulating the clicks. They'll have literally racks and racks of phones.
Yeah.
And they'll have something that is, a galvanic pointer, something that has skin, that has connectivity like skin. And it'll be very, sort of a literally mechanical kind of thing where it's like you'll have racks of pointers that will go down and touch and touch and touch,
Yeah, and that I mean, sort of just, and then thinking about the breadth of this, right? For some reason, popped into my head the what's the word they call them? Like the scooter wranglers, the people that come around and collect them and charge them, and then they reappear the next morning all lined up.
Yeah, juicers. They're called juicers or hunters usually, depending on the company. Lime is juicers. Bird is hunters.
That tracks.
Metaphors.
But the idea then that there's actually sort of that people have seen, I think there's probably even viral videos of these juicers fighting over Lime scooters, like to who gets to charge it, and people driving down the road and seeing a sedan with the trunk open, with stuffed to the brim with as many scooters as possible. Right? Is that a similar? This almost kind of mechanical, largely because it takes place at night, invisible labor, where all of a sudden then the scooters show up the next day all fully charged and where they're supposed to be.
Right. As though by the elves that helped out the cobbler.
Yes.
I think Casey maybe linked to an article recently about another addition to that, which is essentially impound services, who, this is now a third order, who are, because you can essentially, the user is prompted to leave those scooters anywhere, businesses are impounding them as they would other discarded vehicles. So this is they were profiling, I think it was 2 people. And it was interesting in part because I think one owned or used to own a used bike shop. So there were lots of motivations at play there. But they were, just collecting by the thousands these scooters and impounding them, saying, the business has authorized us to collect these on their property. Because
oh, wow.
Yeah, in the area where they operated, if I'm not mistaken, there are more of those scooters than people because it's multiple companies operating.
Right.
So they're, littering the public thoroughfares.
I was in Austin recently, and they've got a trail down by the lake, and there's a sign saying like you can't use motorized scooters on this trail. And I was walking on the trail, and someone, I guess, had used one and left it, and then someone had chucked it over the fence halfway down the embankment to the lake.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can look at those kind of gig economy things. The question will be, how large is the circle we're going to draw? Because, of course, I mean, we're principally looking at mechanical Turks, and we can talk about these other things, particularly in relief, right? I mean, how is this different than similar, but different to what we see in Fiverr or Click Farms, or those kinds of things? Yeah, and I guess operating throughout all of this would be the cultural technique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think we'll probably have to, if we find to call back earlier language that we're doing, if we're going to find the cultural technique, we're probably going to find it in the same way that we find out what the difference between a human and a bot is, right? Just by sort of teasing at, like, it'll never actually,
right.
The cultural technique, like that boundary, is never going to solidify, right? It might be better not even to imagine it as how big or how, like, the circle that the cultural technique in, but more like a kind of network with these branching paths, right? Where else is this cultural technique manifesting itself, as opposed to imagining it as this thing that encompasses all these things, that it's a technique that ends up showing up in various places, and so it's more like a net than it is, a blanket.
A perimeter, perhaps.
Yeah. It's not going to have a perimeter. It's going to have, yeah.
Okay, so that's certainly something we were thinking about. I'm going to flip over here. So the data, and this again is posted on the project page in the supporting resources. There are 2. I moved them into Google spreadsheets just so they were more readily accessible. I was compiling them into spreadsheets, and I was just going to share them through Dropbox or something. But this is a little more consistent, if nothing else. And so we've got 2 samples, the A sample and the B sample. The A sample, pulling that up now. And although, Nathaniel, this isn't going to be shared through Skype, you could potentially look at this if you were of a mind to. You can kind of see the things we're collecting in the A sample. The A sample is it's the broader net. It basically goes 1,000 at a time. Although sometimes when I go to collect, there will be slightly under 1,000 jobs available at that, or hits available at that time. So it's about 1,000. It never exceeds 1,000. You can see the kind of stuff we're collecting there. We've got requesters, the titles, and the descriptions. Those things are consistent across all. Are you resizing stuff?
Oh, sorry, just so I can see all the entries. Sorry about that.
I'll fix it in post. It's no big deal.
Okay.
And so those things are all consistent. What's inconsistent are things like the actual specific instructions. So there's not a super easy way to, at least that I'm aware of, to collect the direct instructions that are parts of some hits. Not all hits have them. Some of them won't let you see the instructions unless you meet the qualifications. So it's a data point that's valuable, but it resists being cataloged in this way.
Interesting.
Yeah. We still get useful data out of the title and the description, right? If we look at some what description you're on right there. If the shopping receipt image is readable, extract the required information, right? That's another good thing is the descriptions tend to be, sort of paragraph-ish, and formally they're pretty similar. So they lend themselves well to the kind of data processing we're going to be doing. So that's kind of what the A sample, you can see we've got duration in seconds. Once we start looking at the data, we might want to look at things like, so for example, if we can classify the different kinds of jobs, the different kinds of hits, we might be able to look at some second order things like, well, how does that map to the time it takes, or things like reward, right? I mean, that's a reward in cents.
So is that duration, is that an estimate of how long the task will take? Okay.
Yeah. And then you can see things like approval rate, which has to do with, so if you do a job, how likely is the requester to accept it as okay? Because they can reject things, essentially.
So it's almost like an acceptance rate.
Yes. And then the time it takes them to do that. And these are being pulled from a third party that is Turker contributed, essentially, I believe. I'll have to check, actually. Some of this comes from Turk itself. Some of this is user contributed.
If I'm reading this right, I was just looking for one that's particularly low, and there's one that's 69%, and it appears to be annotate the requested objects in the bedroom images. Has a lower than average approval rate.
Yeah, which sounds like a complex task, right? Annotate and which is different than pick out the dogs in these pictures.
Yeah, it seems like it's more than just this is a bed. I wonder if this is the bed, and it's. I mean, for some reason it jumped out at me as we recovered from a house fire, right? That the guy that came in and essentially annotated all this shit in our house. I would imagine you'd give someone an image, and the annotation would be more than just this is a chair. It would be this is where you likely got the chair, right. That kind of information.
Yeah. So, we'll see. I mean, even that language, like annotate, right, versus identify, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's lots of neat stuff to pick up here. You can kind of see how I'm doing it. Basically, I'm trying to kind of randomize it. Unfortunately, and I'll talk about this when I write up the methodology stuff, it's not truly random because it's not like I'm saying at any 2 points in this week, I'm just going to do it. It's constrained by, for one thing, I'm trying to leave a certain amount of time between data sample periods, so it's not just, you can envision if it was one and then an hour and then the other, you'd be getting a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah.
Now, some of that's okay, and some hits do last. I mean, some of them you can see their expiration date isn't for a long time. You can see here in column F, available hits, that means like the number of jobs within that category. So like this first one, classify receipt, there's over 3,500 people can do that essentially. Some of them have one, but anywho, so there are it's random within a set of constraints. The other thing is, quite simply, it's not like I'm waking up at 3:45 in the morning to do this, right? It's kind of pseudo random. I'm sure there's a term for this. It's not aleatory. Maybe it's a little heuristic, I suppose.
Yeah.
There are these kind of parameters. The time I have available to do the sampling, because it's not quite just pushing a button. You have to do a little bit of kind of automated cleaning. I have a script for that, which I will be folding into the project as well. It basically is, here's the steps, essentially to remove things like junk characters and then break them into a format that can be read here.
Okay.
So it's, there's some processing there, but so, it's random based on some parameters.
Yeah, and I think those parameters, as I think we've outlined before, right? We don't want to just not knowing what we or knowing what we don't know about mechanical Turks, right? Worried that if we don't space these things out, we'll be responding to a particular uptick that's unique to that.
Right.
These all these kinds of things tend to come out on Monday. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but so in to a certain extent, it's not random precisely because we're trying to avoid things that would happen if it was random, right?
Yeah.
That those constraints or parameters that you're defining also give us a little bit of leverage on the data that we get.
Yeah.
Because we know a little bit, but if you randomize it, you might end up knowing less about where it came from.
Yeah.
Whereas if you're choosing it, you've got some control over that. So you trade off potential bias with your ability to then clearly articulate what you're taking and when and where.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and that's what, we're trying to get a kind of sample. And that's one reason why, things like, I don't mind too much if there is some overlap, because in part what I want to see is what this collection of texts is like. And I mean,
Right.
if you're a user or a machine or whatever, it's like if I dip in a few times, then yeah, I mean, there's some of the same jobs here. It's why I'm not doing, it all has to be unique jobs, because that's not our encounter of this body of texts,
No.
That's not how people encounter it. It's not how machines encounter it. It's I want to get a sample of the thing itself in practice, not the hits as discrete entities.
Yeah, no, I'm not. We're not particularly interested in collecting the biggest number of unique hits like their Pokemon.
Yeah. And I'm thinking in terms of, as I said, about 2 a week of about 1,000 a time. This will be going end of year-ish, so we're probably looking in the neighborhood of 20,000 events, maybe more. And then at some point I'll probably stop collecting, so that we can move on to processing it and it not being a moving target quite so much.
Mm-hmm.
That's the A sample. I'm simultaneously doing the B sample. I collect that data differently because it gives you some different stuff. It's much trickier to automate this collection. So it's fewer. I only get 100 at a time. And I do this once a week, I believe. So, if it's 10 weeks, you get 1,000 of these. You can see it has some of the same stuff. Title requester. It does have the description here at the end. So there is the possibility to fold some of that stuff in with the A sample. I probably won't do that because I kind of want to keep these a little bit separate. But you can see on the B sample there are different things like, and this does come from a third party, so TV. That's a Turker view, which is a third party essentially where Turkers will rate things like requesters, right? So, this person pays generously. This person underpays or pays low, right? Those are essentially categories. You can see sort of the hourly breakdown. Like this first one listed here, the hourly breakdown is over $22, although almost certainly they're not
getting that many hours.
Right, yeah. I mean, we're talking, looks like 127. There's the reward. It takes about an hour. So there's actually some pretty fine-grained data here in terms of an hourly breakdown, how people feel about that, right? This is the approval time. Communication. They have a rating of communication with the requester. Unacceptable, a lot of unrated, poor. There's sort of the rare, good, and excellent.
I see those. Yeah, 2 of them.
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? That, I mean, primarily we're talking unrated, but there's also something, commonsensical about, oh yes, most of your interactions in this channel will probably be unacceptable or bad, because it's like a complaint line in a way. You wouldn't be talking to them unless there were a problem, right?
Right.
It's like, any anytime you get that general feedback, the people who are motivated are going to be upset.
Yeah.
Rejections. So the number of rejections that have been encountered, and blocks as well. And these terms are broken down in these services.
Okay.
This is just shorthand. So you got Turker view, TO.
Now I was going to ask what TO was.
It's a different but similar service. Oh shoot, and what it stands for escapes me right now. Turker. Crud, it'll come to me. But it's a similar service. You can see they don't have the same rating categories, but they're doing some of the same things, right? So here's pay on a 5-point scale.
Okay.
Fast, which is the turnaround. Communication, again, on a 5-point scale. Fairness, that I believe is number of reviews.
Okay.
Terms of service violations. It's Turker OmniView, I believe. Ha! Which is kind of an interesting. I think Omni is the term there.
Interesting. It's the Omni view of someone trapped in a cabinet.
Well, and that's interesting, right? Because the watchers are being watched, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the Turkers are themselves participating in an external surveillance state toward the requesters.
Yeah.
Right. So everybody's got a number in this whole thing. So we can see some of the same data, but I liked this because we might be able to see things like, again, if we were to break down something like categories, we have this more fine-grained notion of how do Turkers feel about their compensation or doing those kinds of jobs.
Yeah.
How do they feel about communication with particular entities that are doing those sorts of things or whatever. It's just there's the possibility for all kinds of ways to put data in conversation with this.
Yeah, I mean, even I like the category pay sentiment.
Yeah.
Right, the use of sentiment there as opposed to a more quantitative kind of measure.
Or even just pay,
right.
Which
the
other one uses.
It's sentiment.
Mm-hmm. So we're getting less data. I mean, it's what you'd expect. Less data, but a thicker slice. Whereas the A sample, you're getting more data, but it's a little bit thinner slice because you're losing all of this, Turker talk back stuff.
Yeah.
So those are the samples, as I mentioned. I'll be writing up a bit about, the method, so collections, what we just talked about, collection. And I'll fold in here's the script I'm using to clean this data. Here's what I'm going through. But we can start to see how even the sections of the work itself, we'd have an introduction, probably predicated on that outline, at least partially. We can have a section on theoretical approach. That'll be interesting if that remains just a section, or if that's the kind of thing that manifests throughout the whole discussion, right? It kind of speaks to what we're trying to do with this, right? Because if we're making a kind of theoretical argument, then it's not like, okay, well, theory is just a box you tick where we're saying we're using this approach.
We wouldn't. It's going to be much less of how it normally gets set up, right? This is our framework, because it's not really the frame so much as it's the way we're moving through it. Yeah,
if the purpose of the work is to do that, then yes, it wouldn't just be this a thing you can check. The way that potentially the methodology section would be, right? Here's the data that we're collecting, and here's why, because this paper will not be probably methodological in its thrust. It'll be discussing its methods in order to explicate here's what we did and why, right? The rhetoric of what we did and why. So that section probably will be, I anticipate, a little bit more discrete. The theory thing may end up being, either discrete or that's the thrust of the whole work.
Yeah.
Anywho, so I'll be writing that up.
It could be interesting too, because there's also a sense in which thinking about the relationship between the theory and the methodology, to a certain extent, they are tightly linked for us too, right? That in many ways our theory is the way that we're approaching this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Right. Yes. Yeah. I see what you mean. And I mean, as rhetoricians, we're hopefully aware of that. I mean, it's difficult to make these things hermetic, right? I mean, it's tough
yeah,
to try and say, well, I talk about this here, and it only, it's like it's a Lego block or something. It's these things connect with each other so much. It's hard to try and pull them into a straight line in some ways.
yeah. This was so. So when you were at the data collection boot camp, I was at the research or the Field Methods Institute down in Texas that Casey Boyle hosts, and he does this whole riff on methods, looking at the etymology, and basically method just means about the way. And so there's a way in which you can have a discrete method section, but in theoretical work, the method is the way that you wrote up the piece, right? It's the way that you're linking sources to each other and the ways in which thought follows a particular trajectory, right? Your method is the kind of ways in which you're organizing all the different facets of your argument. So,
yeah.
But we're doing that, but we also have this data collection component, which does demand a kind of discrete method section where we outline the kinds of steps that, right, the script that you develop to use this. So we're doing both those things at the same time. So there's a way in which we'll have these discrete sections and then also indiscrete performances of them.
Yeah. And probably we can find work, that operates in a way that we'd like to operate,
Yeah.
These pieces, for example, are doing similar things, so maybe we can proceed in that similar way. Excuse me. Yeah. So that's where we're going from here. Data collection's ongoing. One thing we talked about was updating Manifold, of course. So we'll want to talk to the publisher Jeff about if that's an option.
Yeah.
And you were talking to him anyway
about promotional stuff, but
right. Which is something we can obviously discuss here about since what we're trying to do is we were talking about with Kathleen. If we want people to be engaged, how are we going to do that? How are we going to find them? How are we going to get them interested at least to contribute a part? They don't have to stick with us the entire time, but hey, here's what we're doing now, and we think you'd be someone who could really help us out with that and contribute meaningfully. So that's certainly something we can talk about with the publisher. Is there anything else I'm forgetting here?
I think that covers our thoroughly covers our agenda.
I'm just going to check the notes thing because I was sort of making, let's see, data schedule, update Manifold, bring in guests. Oh yeah, and that was one thing. Kathleen did mention a few guests. I thought some really cool ones that we may consider going forward. She did mention, of course, Cheryl and Doug at Kairos, in part because Kairos uses a non-anonymous peer review process.
Yeah.
So they may be able to talk to us about those issues of attribution, of making a case for this is peer-reviewed work. It's just not peer-reviewed in the classical sense of you finish the manuscript, you send it anonymously to two people who represent your field. It's a different notion, and in many ways a broader notion of peer review and an in-progress notion.
Yeah, no, I like. I think one of the things that we hit upon, or somebody hit upon, right, is the idea that if it's still around at some point.
You said that.
that means I loved it. That was so great when that person said that. No, but the idea that if it lasts, if it actually is durable, that is it being peer reviewed.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Because peers are dealing with it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So good. That was a smart option. That was really good.
Well, and Kathleen talked about that in terms of it being formative, I believe.
Yeah.
Peer review as formative rather than peer review as evaluative.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that that distinction I think is important for us too. Like, no, we want peer review that's formative.
She mentioned Matt Gold with Manifold, and first we'll see if we can update. Maybe then, because right now we wouldn't talk to him necessarily because if we're a iteration behind, I think that would be that would be the substance of that conversation. Oh, we need an update.
It would be. I think that would be gauche. Yeah, can you come talk to us about an older version of a thing?
I'm going to complain about something that's been fixed.
Yeah. But it looks like you guys are still using beta. Yeah, we've got a lot of problems with it.
Mentioned Dan Whaley with Hypothesis, which you've used.
Yes.
So if that comes into play later when we do something like, have people look at readings we're doing or whatever collaboratively, that might be someone to bring in.
Mm-hmm.
Trevor Schultz talking about this notion of the blur between play and labor, and that might be something that would feed into this cultural technique or the gig economy. Gosh, I remember just seeing this Uber commercial that literally did this. Have you seen this one where like the guy's playing basketball? He's like, "Now I'm working. Now I'm playing." And he's earning. He calls it earning, playing. And sort of, it's almost like those pharmaceutical commercials where they're talking about the atrocious side effects, and people are, I'm gardening, and it's like, risk of death. And
right.
So he might have something there, and then also, and I need to do this, talk to an IRB person, and especially if we're going to be putting stuff on Mechanical Turk, probably have to go through IRB. And then also, I do want to, maybe after data collection, talk about some different possibilities in terms of when we're looking at textual data, when we're doing text mining. I've got some ideas about, as I mentioned, like word vectors, document vectors, topic models, but I'd like to sort of set up, here are some of the things I'd like to do, and then just have someone who's more deeply versed in stats, particularly looking at text, say,
yeah,
for what you want to do, that sounds okay, or, here's a good idea, or you're way off base. I mean, all of that's going to be helpful,
Yeah. And then we did get, Casey sent me a name of someone we might want to talk to. It's a media scholar at University of Toronto. His name is Tero Karpi. He's Finnish, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right.
Can you spell it?
Tero, and then last name Karppi.
Okay.
But he does stuff about affect and so on sort of social platforms. But is interested also in non-human agency in ways that might be interesting for us. But basically, yeah, this is, in his writings, Karppi has explored different social media platforms and mechanisms of extracting value out of users. So in many ways, precisely at that, right, that it may be that the cultural technique we're looking at goes back to something like, those early online video games, right, where you get people to, when Ian Bogos did his sort of tongue-in-cheek cow clicker game, that it may be that may be also a kind of parallel or perpendicular, right? That's the early days of this technique, is that kind of gamification where, well, if we can get them to, watch ads by playing a game, right? Is that tied into this kind of thing? Like the techniques for extracting value out of users, right? That becomes a way of then thinking about, right? Because even that language of extracting value, right? Yeah. The idea of a click farm, the idea of gold mining, that kind of thing. This notion of mining the internet for value, thinking about it in terms of a resource that gets extracted.
Yeah, metaphorical, a natural resource, right? That language, mining. Yeah, a book just came out that one of the things it talks about is, are you talking about gamification? I mean, gamification's already had its backlash where it's, where it's we're sort of conscious of the notion of, it's the same toil you've been doing, but now, you're a commander because you've got extra points.
It's over when it shows up in pedagogy journals. When people start talking about gamification in their pedagogy, you're like, oh, so this thing ended 5 years ago.
Scholarship is, inherently conservative.
Yeah.
It understandably comes after those waves because it's doing its scholarly due diligence. So yeah, it's tough to be
Yeah.
bleeding edge. And now that loop is so tight where the backlash is simultaneous with the thrust anyway.
Yeah, no, I think the term that that a few of us have been using is we use the term front lash.
Front lash, eh?
Yeah,
Simul-lash.
it's simulash. It's basically the you get the yeah. It's almost like there's some sort of quantum physics thing where actually the backlash arrives after
Right.
people have already responded to
I
the
know what you're
backlash.
thinking, and I'm already upset about it.
Yes, that I think that is basically where Twitter's at. Now I know a lot of people are going to say X. No one said it yet. You've got to wait for that to like wait your turn.
All right, so that looks like to do. I'm gonna, I'm doing data collection. I'm gonna contact those two folks. You're gonna talk to the publisher about updates and publicity ideas. And
Yeah.
then if there are any of those guest folks you'd like to contact as well,
Yeah, I can do that. I can.
we can
I'll
do that.
I'll send out. Yeah, because we've got nice summaries of the project, so I think that'll be.
Yeah, which is useful because, it's one thing to say, hey, go to the website and sift through it.
Yeah.
It's another thing to say, here's a paragraph, that you can read.
Yeah.
through.
Hey, can we have an hour of your time? Also, here's some homework.
Yeah. It's, you got to connect the dots.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then as I mentioned, I'll get that methodology stuff up. Gosh, it's been on my to-do. It just keeps getting bumped down.
Yeah.
All right, so that's that. Oh, and as we wrap up, one thing I haven't been doing these entire things are, if you're watching this and you're interested in contributing, please know that we'd love to have you on board. If you can think of ways you can contribute, if you'd like to be a video guest, if you'd like to point us towards some readings, if you'd like to dispute anything we're doing.
If the thing we said made you really angry, email Jeremy.
I'm happy. That's in part what we want to do is at least partially deal with adversarial perspectives. I mean, that's the part of formative feedback, right? I mean, you don't wait till the end to say, oh, you did this wrong. Here's what you should have done. Let's try and incorporate that as it goes, or at least engage it. If not, even if it's ultimately rejected, let's engage it in progress rather than as a check at the end.
Yeah, because if it's not clear, I mean, we're spitballing on it. I mean, this is very much, as we promised, this is very much think aloud kind of stuff. So, half the stuff we said, we may not know it or potentially may not even be committed to it. So any kind of, as Jeremy points out, any kind of formative feedback, however you want to stage it.
And probably the best way would just be email. Our email addresses are here right on the project page. It's right in the paragraph description here. Mm-hmm. I suspect probably email would be the most convenient way.
You can tweet me, because the benefit of yelling at us on Twitter is free all bad press is good press. So
should I pull up your...
Do that.
There you are. You can see auto-completing to a bunch of sports people. So you can see Nathaniel's at Sophist Monster with an underscore connecting them there.
You can date people when they got on Twitter based on the use of the underscore. That eventually went away for combo names. I love
the underscore.
I do too.
It serves, it's like putting parentheses around the area code. It has a job.
Mm-hmm. I put it up there with capitalizing the first letter of every word in a hashtag. Makes it easier to read.
Camel case.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you can tweet at Nathaniel. I am largely withdrawn from social media intentionally.
You can just cut out media is there in parentheses.
You can contact me via ham radio.
Uh-huh.
But email is probably a convenient way. But certainly, we'd love to hear your ideas, and we'd love to have them shape the project.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess that's it. Otherwise, we'll do this fortnightly. We'll see if we have a guest lined up for next time. Otherwise, it'll be us recapping what we've done.
Okay.
All right, I guess that's it. I will see you.
Bye.
Yeah.